Welcome, everybody, to this very special episode of A Story Always, in which we are joined by Oli Jeffery to talk about his recent game, Quietus. But before we get to this, just let me remind you that if you are seeing us live on Twitch, or even if you're not, please follow us on Twitch so you can get the latest notifications when we go live. And if you want to support the channel, you can become a subscriber, get access to the videos as soon as as soon as we stop streaming them, so you don't even have to wait for them to go up on YouTube. And if you have Amazon Prime and you haven't used your free subscription, you can do that. That shit is free, and you might as well use it with me. And if you're seeing us from YouTube, you can please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, share the video around. It helps a lot. I cannot express how much it helps when people share the video around and all of that. And if you just want to support the channel and help us continue doing this kind of work, you can give us a one-time donation on our Ko-fi page, which you can find underneath the video. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Oli. Thanks a lot for being here today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, first of all, why don't you introduce yourself to the spectators?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm Oli Jeffery. I'm a games designer, also games layout artist. So you might have seen my layout stuff on Legacy 2nd Edition and Dunfell Glowing Embers and Gauntlet Codex. Contributed a lot to Codex Zine over the couple of years that it's been running now. And also wrote a Dungeon World starter called The Foulness That Came to Dunfell Township, which was kind of like a gross Lovecraftian Cronenbergian dungeon world. And I'm currently in the midst of a Kickstarter for my game Quietus, which is a game of melancholy horror.
Yes, indeed. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Quietus, kind of the quick pitch of the game. What is it about?
Okay, so it is a one-shot, more or less prepless role-playing game. It is for a GM and one or two players, so it's great for that kind of like that pickup game where people have dropped out for an evening or something, or you've just got a couple of friends around. And it is based on the Forged in the Dark rules, which are the rule set that powers Blades in the Dark. It's drifted quite a lot from that, obviously, because Blades in the Dark is a very complex kind of campaign system, and this is directed at just doing a kind of a quick, short, well, like an average session, but like a one-off, sharp story, focusing very much in on just horror and tragedy. And yeah, it's in the genre of what I call melancholy horror, which is films like Oculus and The Strangers. And even going back to the 70s with stuff like Don't Look Now. So anything that can make you kind of like cry and scream within the same piece of fiction, that's a good model for the sort of stories that it can tell.
Cool. So yeah, just talking about that, what do you think defines melancholy horror? And also a second question, and probably a stupid one, why melancholy horror are not melancholic horror? Because maybe it's just because English is my second language, but that just like fucks me up for some reason. I don't know.
No, you're right. It's grammatically incorrect, but I like how it sounded, and so I called it melancholy horror first, and then like you say, I did think, oh shit, that should probably be melancholic horror, but I didn't like the olic. It sounds kind of like sounds like a disease. So I kept it as melancholy horror, and you're the first person to bring it up.
Sorry,
I got away with it. I know, and I'm such a stickler for grammar normally that it should have been melancholic, but it's melancholy horror.
Okay, fair enough. So, what would you say defines melancholy horror for you?
Yeah, so obviously it's not a genre I've invented because I haven't made any of these films, but I don't think it's been talked about a lot as a subgenre, but I think it definitely is one there. It's something that came around in the kind of the early 2000s. I would say is the kind of the birthplace of the modern form of the subgenre, when you had the French New Wave horror movies coming out, and they kind of combined that kind of artsy French movie sensibility, where you have dramas about people who are sad, with just like extreme violence. So you've got movies like Inside and Martyrs, and let's say Switchblade Romance is more of like a standard slasher. But there was this real mix of just like really like difficult to watch violence at some points, and tragedy and backstory beyond that. Ill is another good example. And then that kind of translated over into the US, where you have the American take on it, where you've got things like The Strangers, and with The Strangers and some of the ones that came after it, the tragedy and the horror were a bit more separated. When you've got something like Inside, the French movie, I won't try and pronounce the French version of the title because any French people watching this will just be screaming at me. But it's all kind of intertwined. Whereas when you have The Strangers, you've got a sad situation, which is that there's a couple that are going to break up probably because there was a proposal that was turned down, and now they're stuck together out in the wilderness, not the wilderness, but like out at their family summer house. And so that's sad, and then killers turn up. And then terrifying. So it's like you're in a bad situation, it gets worse. And Mike Flanagan, who did the recent version of The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, he and his writing partner, and also sometimes his wife is often in them, and co-writes some of them as well. I can't remember her name right now, or his writing partner's name. But he is the real king of those real kind of like tragic horror movies in the current milieu, because he started off with one called Absentia, which sounds really dumb because it's a movie about a troll, essentially, like a literal troll that lives under a bridge, but it's just the most heartbreaking, the most depressing drama, plus also terrifying ghosts and weird insecty troll creatures. And I think like the French movie started with that kind of like artsy sensibility, and then adding in the violence, he kind of took the spooky version of it basically. So he did his kind of like low budget indie movies, because that's a good way of doing a cheap film basically. It's just to have people talking. And so you can tell if you're a good enough writer, and he's a very good writer, a satisfying story without much in the way of special effects, and then just add like a layer of spookiness onto it as well, which makes it a genre film. And if it's a genre film, it's more likely to shift tickets than a straight drama. So he did that. He did Oculus, which is a massive influence on this game, and he's done a few others as well. But Oculus and Haunting a Hill House are two of the real big influences on this.
So what made you connect with this subgenre of horror? What is the thing that really kind of like strikes you about this kind of movies?
Yeah, I think it's every so often when there's a movie, like a horror movie that critics like, they suddenly start talking about elevated horror, and that bugs the shit out of me.
Yeah, that's so elitist.
Exactly, it's exactly what it is. But I think because the critics, because they don't watch much horror, honestly, because they only review films that end up in the cinema, and there's a lot of like straight to DVD stuff. And I'm painting with a very broad brush here, of course. There are like horror critics who write about that sort of stuff and know what they're actually talking about, and think that elevated horror is nonsense. But what it basically means is a good horror movie. But yeah, so a lot of the kind of the snobbier critics will just kind of think of Friday the 13th, and don't get me wrong, I love Friday the 13th, but I appreciate that it's silly. And then they'll see something like Hereditary, and they'll go, "Oh, this kind of film just hasn't existed before. When it has, it's been existing all the way back to forever. But the kind of sorry, I got on a rant about elitist critics, and I've forgotten what the actual question was now. So what appeals to me about them? It's because horror is cheap to make. You can get some crap horror because it's not only cheap to make, it is cheap to make, and people will watch it because there's a fan base out there. I'm very much part of that fan base. And so there's a lot of kind of like cheap, shoddy horror, which ends up on the kind of the arse end of lists in Amazon Prime. And then, so it's satisfying when you get a really well-made horror movie. And because the stories that you tend to tell with horror tend to be horrible, they tend to be like nasty, unpleasant stories. If you're going to make a quote-unquote serious horror film, you kind of have to... The non-horror elements of it have to play into that as well, which is why tragedy and sadness and melancholy tend to come up a lot. So in something like Hereditary or Oculus, you've always got these kind of like these backstories of just trauma, essentially, which kind of both informs and reflects the horror that you've got there. So it's satisfying to kind of see it all mesh together. I think that's why they appeal to me.
Yeah, and also for me, I think something really cool about horror is that since it's one of the few genres of films where there's still a lot of like middle budget movies being made. Well,
yes.
In many others, you either have the indie movie done for basically nothing, and that is not available anywhere, or the like super blockbuster massive thing that has to be like commercially like tested for the audience and all that. Like in many other places, like that kind of movie, middle of the road budget, more a little bit of experimentation and all that, it's really hard to find. But in horror, they can get away with doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, those movies don't really exist anymore, and that's bad for the industry, I think, as well, because you get people who've done one indie movie and then suddenly they're doing Star Wars 2 and or not Star Wars 2 actually, because I like that one.
Yeah, me too. Fuck haters. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, but like you get people who've only ever worked on like an indie movie and then suddenly they're in charge of this like $200 million movie and like they don't know how to do it. Basically, they haven't had that kind of education of going through doing the 10 million, the 20 million. So yeah, with horror, you can get a lot for your money as well.
Yeah.
So like Sinister was made for $1 million, I think, and they did that because they managed to do that because the producer just put Ethan Hawke up in his house. Like I think Ethan Hawke was literally just like sleeping on the guy's sofa in order to make that movie whilst they were there, which is one of the reasons I love Ethan Hawke. But yeah, you can make something with 1 to 5 million and make it, because you don't have to do much with it. You're not going to have like a big shootout or anything, and it can look fantastic for that money. Because 1 to 5 million is enough to make people standing still and talking look very nice indeed. Yeah, so there's a great kind of like low but not like shoestring budget movies being made out there.
And what did you think about? Why did you wanted to bring these kind of movies and stories into an RPG? What do you think they can bring into the RPG scene that you didn't see before?
I think literally just that I haven't seen it before. So I think because they're a relatively recent, like it's really kind of like the last. I say relatively recent. It's 20 years. I'm old. But they've only been around for like 20 years, and there's a lot of horror RPGs, but they've been treading a lot of quite similar ground. So I love a good Cthulhu game, but there are a lot of Cthulhu games because that was the first one that the first horror RPG that came out, so it always sells as well, which is the other thing. I probably should have put Cthulhu in this to sell other copies, but there isn't any. So you've got a lot of Cthulhu games. You've got, I suppose you have the World of Darkness is resurgent a bit now, although White Wolf kind of shat the bed, so it's a bit sad that that's happened. But you've got some slasher stuff as well. So you have things like The Final Girl, which is one of my all-time favorite games, and you've got Dread. But aside from, I think there's really just 10 Candles, which does a similar kind of thing to what Quietus is doing, and 10 Candles is usually just kind of that. I know you can play it with different scenarios, but it's mostly just that one scenario. That's the one that most people play anyway. So I don't think it had been covered, certainly not covered sufficiently in role-playing games, and I thought there was a particular take on it that I could bring that Forge in the Dark could help with.
So that's the next question, I guess. Why did you choose Forge in the Dark, the Blaze in the Dark system? Because as you were saying before, Blaze in the Dark, quite a heavy game, lots of mechanics, at least for an indie game. Why did you choose to go with that framework?
It came out of me GMing quite a bad game of Blades in the Dark. I'd pushed it way too, because there was part of the kind of the GM and player agreement in Blades in the Dark is that you agree between you on how kind of like gritty to swashbuckling it's going to be, and I pushed it way too gritty, and it was a bit of a painful grind. I've played it since, and I've kind of got into it more, and obviously because I'm writing a game in it now, I think it's a great game. But that very first couple of games that I ran it far too grindy, far too gritty, and it just seemed like it was tense to the extent that it was almost horrific. And so that spoke to me, and that building sense of tension that you get with it, the fact that you can push yourself, that you've got that building stress always, and also the flashbacks, because the flashbacks in Blades in the Dark are used in a kind of very heisty, almost like the. Do you remember Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure? Do you remember Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure?
Yes.
With the time travel in that, like the Blades in the Dark flashbacks almost work like Bill and Ted time travel.
A bit like that, yeah.
Yeah, where it's like, oh no, I always meant to do that. But in a lot of the movies that I was referencing, flashbacks featured really heavily, because it tends to be that there is an event going on in the present, but that is very intense and kind of isolated and unusual. So you have the couple being attacked by the three masked killers and the strangers, and there's not a lot of time for character development whilst you're just kind of running and screaming, which is what a lot of the kind of the in the now action is there. So any character development that does happens in flashbacks. And that's very key to Oculus as well. And in Oculus, it goes to the point where the flashbacks start bleeding in, and there's kind of like some weird time travel shenanigans at the end of the movie, which is great. I wouldn't actually call it shenanigans. That's that makes it sound way more fun than it is. That is a gut punch of a movie. But so I liked how deftly it handled flashbacks, and how it used flashbacks to kind of build on the mechanics, and I thought that was something that I could build on, and it's kind of been repurposed in Quietus, because it's not about that kind of heisty, look how clever I am flashback. It is the way it works in Quietus is you start off with one dice and you have to build up, and there's a series of options that you have to be able to build up your dice pool. And so you can get help from other people, but if you get help from other people, then they're going to be in as much trouble as you are if you fail, especially side characters, because the side characters are like the cop that turns up and is meant to save everyone and then just immediately gets his throat slit. It's that character, the side characters in Quietus. So you can help You can get help from other people, but potentially bring them into trouble with you. You can push yourself, but as you push yourself, you might panic, and you can bring in the flashbacks, or as they're called in Quietus, it's called revealing a scar, and you get bonus dice if you tell me a sad story that is somehow, or tell the GM, I should say, a sad story which is somehow relevant to the situation at hand. So because in a one shot you can't have, well, you could, but it'd be largely pointless XP. And XP is an excellent way of pointing pointing your players at the kind of game experience you want them to have. So in Dungeon World, you get XP for trying and doing ridiculous things. I'm trying to think of another example. So in D&D, you get XP for fighting monsters because it's a game about fighting monsters. You can't do that in a one-shot game. So instead, the experience I want people to have is scary and sad. Those are the two things that it's meant to do. So you have the scary, which the GM has to bring, and the sad tends to come from the players, and they are pointed at that because their characters stand a better chance of survival the more sad stories they tell, effectively.
So, talking a little bit about the nature of the game, it is a one shot, only for one shots. So something that we're asking on the chat is if there's room to manage drawn out, slow burn, horrific experience like in The Haunting of the Hill House with Quietus. They were asking about multiple sessions, which I think is a no-no. But do you think that you can have that kind of similar experience?
I think you could, and it's something that's been asked a few times. So the game as it is purely one shot, but you could easily do a sequel. So you could bring in the same killer, the same big bad, whatever it turns out to be, or any surviving characters. But if you look at The Haunting of Hill House, you could do that with a couple of tweaks, because each of those episodes, especially at the start of the series, it kind of diverges a little bit once they get about halfway. But each of them is a story about one person within the family, and it does do that kind of the in the now desperation and the tragic flashbacks. So yeah, I think you could tell a linked series of vignettes, definitely, and make it all about one family. You could do the it was the guy that wrote Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, I know. I don't know the name. I'm really bad with names.
I was desperately not trying to say Tarantino. Obviously, I know Tarantino didn't like Catcher in the Rye, but he also does a similar thing where he has the characters coming in and out of his film. Yeah, and J.D. Salinger, that's it. J.D. Salinger did that with his short stories. So you could do that, but I would like to write some official supporting rules for connected play, something like the train wreck rules in Fiasco, because that's another big influence, being that it's the kind of it's the classic one shot game, really. So that will either be a supplement at some point, or possibly even a stretch goal, depending on how many stretch goals we burn through, because we are going through them very fast, which is lovely. But I do have to think of some more now in order to keep that momentum going.
Nice. Another interesting thing about the game is that it only supports up to 2 players. Why is there this kind of cap in the number of players?
Yeah, that was very intentional. It's reflecting the films that inspired it, because if you look at those films, they are usually 1 or 2 people. So you've got Hush, you've got one person in the house, a couple of side characters. You have The Strangers, you have just the couple. Oculus, you've got the 2 main characters. And that is a very different type of horrific experience to a horror movie, and in this case, a horror game with more players, because when you have more people, you can have death. You can have kill scenes, and that is a pressure release because you kind of know, and Dread does this. So looking at Dread, which is kind of models like slasher stuff better. You build and build and build the tension until someone dies, and then the tower gets rebuilt, and it's an inbuilt pause. Now there's a possibility of the tower falling over again immediately, but in say something similar like Scream 2, which is a slasher movie that I really love, you generally know that if someone has died, then no one else is going to die for at least say 10 minutes. And you get that kind of that building, that peak of pressure, and then it goes down, and you can do some other stuff. When you only have 2 people, and you know that it's just going to build and build and build and build and build, and you're going to get closer and closer to these people, and yet you know something horrible is likely to happen to them at the end. And because you only have 2 people, it can pretty much only happen at the end, which means you're constantly in fear. And it doesn't always happen, but it often does. You're constantly in fear of this downer ending. Because also when you have only 2 people, 1 or 2 people, and it's a horror movie, the equivalent of a TPK is quite likely. And when you've spent, an hour and a half either watching these people, or in the case of a role-playing game, pretending to be these people, that's a real gut punch, and that's intentional. Both in like the movies mean to do that, because movies are essentially it's a very manipulative medium, and I don't mean that badly. It's a comedy is intended to make you laugh, a tragedy is meant to make you cry. And so so that's why it's 2. It's so that there's no pressure valve. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse until it ends one way or another.
Yeah, and the deaths themselves are kind of they don't get cheapened. Like it's not something like you get used to.
Yes.
Before kind of the ending of the final part of the story.
Yeah.
So,
there's no Kevin Bacon getting an arrow through the neck and everyone kind of chuckling. You won't get that.
Yeah, because that kind of stuff is, like, as you say, good for pacing and building up to the final, but is it's like a release. It's like a completely different pacing and tension arc. So talking about that constant build up of tension, how does the game represent that through the mechanics?
Sure. Okay. So there are 2 competing scores. So it kind of has. I mean, you can't really win and lose in a role playing game, because as long as you're having a nice time, you've won. Not a nice time necessarily in this game, because it's scary and depressing, but like an enjoyable time. But there is a win and a lose condition. So you have scores of hope and despair, and failed rolls or so failed rolls can make your despair score go up. There's also a GM currency which can make it go up, which can kind of build up more slowly. So the GM has a currency called Dread that builds up on like less severe failed rolls, because much like Blaze in the Dark, this has the three tiers of not difficulty really, but positioning.
Yeah.
So you start off on uneasy, you go to tense, and then you go to desperate. And the way I say it is it's kind of like a codification of how loud and screechy the violins are on the soundtrack in the imaginary movie at that point. So if your dread gets to 5, your character dies. And that's it. And it's not hit points. So you can be absolutely fine up until that point, but you're not your dread, sorry, your despair. Your despair is building and building and building, so you know your character's in danger even if they appear fine. And then it can just be that very sudden, just all of a sudden. And you also have hope, which is the kind of the win condition score, because horror without hope isn't scary, it's just kind of grindy and unpleasant. And so you have a shared hope score between the 2 players, and if you get that to 5, then you either escape or you kill the killer or whatever's kind of appropriate in the fiction. So you're constantly building to these 2 scores, and the way that the mechanics work and the way that the currencies work, they tend to build in unison. So it's like as one goes up, the other goes up, and it usually ends up on both of them being at a level of 4, and so you end up with that one kind of like last crucial dice roll which decides things one way or another. So that's how we kind of emulate that. There's also anxiety, which is known as stress in Blades in the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a spendable resource that you can get, so you're getting more and more anxious and more closer to panic is the thing, as you are, say, pushing yourself, or whenever you bring in one of the scar scenes, or whenever you help someone else out. And in Blades in the Dark, when your stress maxes out, you're taken out of the scene in some way, because this is a one shot. We didn't want that because there's no opportunity to kind of come back and fix that later on. So instead, when your anxiety hits 10, your character starts panicking. So that's both in the fiction and mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that from that point on, you can only take desperate rolls. So you have to describe that. So you have to describe your character to only taking desperate rolls. But mechanically, you can only roll on the desperate tier as well, which means that you're more likely to face the harsh consequences if you fail. And so it can be that kind of like third act death spiral that sometimes happens in those movies. So that's how we've tried to emulate that between those 3 scores, or 4 scores if you count the GM score of Dread.
Why is the hope score shared by the players?
That is just a balancing thing, because despair comes up quite often as a consequence in dice rolls, so that's handled more mechanically, whereas hope depends on the players doing something which can potentially raise their hope. So not every roll will raise your hope. It has to be something which actually would in some way aid your character in escaping. So some rolls will just be like evading the killer who is trying to find you right now, or they will be coping with a past consequence. So they're like narrative consequences in this. So say you fall and break your leg, for example. That doesn't have any mechanical consequences to it, but you are expected to kind of deal with it in the fiction. So some of the roles thereafter might be just dealing with that, which doesn't actually help you get away. But say if you are say you're searching for car keys, or trying to sneak away, something like that, that might raise your hope score. So almost every role has the opportunity to raise despair, but not every role has the opportunity to raise hope, which is why that's shared, and despair is not. Also, it gives the opportunity for one character, I should say, to die. Hopefully none of the players die. One character to die and the other to survive, if those scores are separate.
So that's kind of the more tension, horror part of the game. Could you tell us a little bit about more the melancholic part, the flashbacks or scar scenes, and how do they kind of play out and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So the scar scenes mechanically are there to get you extra dice. So that's that's kind of the carrot to get players to do them. And whenever you want to bring in an element that could help you, so say a weapon or a key or like a car to get away or something like that, if there's anything that could add a dice, you have to do what's called revealing a scar, which in short means telling me a relevant, sad story. You also have to do that if you want to introduce any side characters, so that the GM is encouraged not to bring in any side characters or NPCs, essentially, unless the players introduce them, because you're trying to keep the characters isolated. So if you ever want to bring in anything that could help you, either in the fiction or mechanically, it has to come in via a scar scene. And they can be anything, as long as it is both sad and in some way relevant from your character's past. So as an example, we were playing a playtest and someone wanted I think they were, that's it. They were playing a new age therapist, and they were being attacked by like this Manson-esque cult leader, for reasons that are spurious now. I can't quite remember the actual motivation was. But they wanted a salt lamp to fend him off with, and a salt lamp is a fairly reasonable thing for a new age therapist to have in their studio. But if they wanted to introduce that as an actual item that can help them out in the story, they had to introduce it via a scar. It was Kate Bullock that was playing a therapist, and so this was set in Joshua Tree, and so Kate told a story about where her character was driving through the desert and accidentally hit a coyote, and then had to content warning for animal violence here if anyone wants to mute for a sec, and then had to put the coyote out of its misery with a rock, despite being I think her character was a vegetarian. So we kind of cut back and forth in between her trying to fend off this kind of Manson-esque figure with the salt lamp, and her character putting the wounded coyote out of its misery with a rock on the side of the road. So that's the sort of thing you can get. It's not. It doesn't always have to be that literal. So there was I did a party of one podcast with Jeff Stormer.
Yeah.
And his take on it, which was really good, was, I think there was one point where he was trying to sneak by someone, and obviously his character, obviously unless you've listened to it, his character was kind of like a Wall Street guy, so he wasn't like a survivalist or anything. So it's like he didn't have sneaking skills, but then he told a story about how he was always ignored at parties. And how he always just kind of like slunk into the background, and he used that then to get the extra guy, in that he's just a kind of an easy to miss person.
Cool. So how do you find the flashbacks influenced kind of the main story that is being told? Because I found playing the game like a quite interesting influence that the flashback have in the story, that kind of going forward after the flashback. How do you kind of see that influence in it?
Yeah, okay, yeah, so sometimes they are purely kind of character moments. Sometimes they can be kind of unrelated in kind of like the way that The Strangers does it. It's like you have this couple's relationship, and then you have the terrifying thing that's happened in the present. So you can play it purely like that. Or the other thing, that because you're using them essentially to create backstory, and using it to create backstory at moments which are what's what I'm looking for? It's kind of at key moments in the present day story. So whenever tension is highest is when you're most likely to want to bring in a flashback, and then you develop more, you find out more about the characters at the highest moments of tension. But when we played it with you, for example, not only did we reveal like character backstory, but we reveal kind of like story backstory as well. I said story way too many times there, but plot, I suppose, backstory, because you were playing you were like a punk kid who'd burgled their grandmother, I think it was, wasn't it?
My rich grandmother, we tried to steal something from her, money from her, and that went horribly wrong.
Yes, yeah. So we revealed not only stuff about your character, but we also revealed what went horribly wrong there. We revealed the kind of, in more kind of like the Oculus style of showing not only the characters in the past, but how the past informs the present. And you can absolutely do that as well. That's kind of up to the play group. But the rules kind of like point you at, you can do either of these things. Both are valid. One's probably a little easier to just do like character stuff. But once you've played it a few times, or if you're kind of like really into your story games, you can bring in those flashbacks, which not only inform your character but inform why you're here now.
Yeah, and there is a kind of ammunition for the GM to use after which you did very effectively.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Yes, thank you. That once someone has introduced an element from their past, you can then use that in the present. So that's something that's kind of like becomes canonically true. So, for example, in the game that I played with Jeff, his flashbacks revealed his character to be basically more and more of an asshole, and we kind of lent into that and made the person that was attacking him like an aggrieved ex-employee, who actually ended up being really kind of like in that case the bad guy ended up kind of being the tragic figure. So yeah, you can always use what the players give you and then kind of bring it back in. So in your case, because that was well positioned to do so because we were doing ghosts. So whoever was revealed to be dead in the backstory, I could just bring back in as a ghost, which was kind of handy.
Yeah.
But you can do that thematically. You can do that in what you think would scare the characters or the players. So you kind of like pick up on little bits that they reveal, and then reuse and recycle them.
Yeah, it's kind of like a really cool meta conversation between the players and the GM, saying like, this is something that I find scary and creepy and sad, and also something that I think comfortable bringing into the story. Now take in and use it against me.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Yeah, because if someone brings something up in the flashback, that means that they're at least comfortable to talk about it. So yeah, you do kind of have implicit permission, and there are safety tools recommended in the game for more like explicit permission. But as you say, that gives you the implicit permission to use that again.
And how does the characters change through the course of the game, or how does it change how we see them? And maybe also talk a little bit about the character creation stuff, which I forgot to mention before, how kind of to see how do they start and how does
sure. So it's a very, very stat-like game. You can play it without paper, as long as you've got a fairly a decent memory for names, which I do not. So I usually have to write them down. But there's no character sheets or anything like that. You can play with just tokens. So there's no action dice like there are in Blazing the Dark. There's no stats to keep track of. So character creation is handled through a series of leading questions. So the questions determine where you are, why you're there, why it's painful for you to be there, what your characters are scared of, your characters' relationship to each other. I always like to think of character creation as part of play, but sometimes it can be kind of like the lonely fun part of play. You can, if you're playing D&D, you don't have to all roll those characters up together, and sometimes that can even be a bit of a drag because it takes like 2 hours, and if you've only got one rule book, then it's kind of a pain. But in this, the character creation is definitely part of the play, because if we use the movie metaphor again, the character creation kind of summarizes what would be the first act in the movie. So it's all of that introduction. So it's introducing you to the characters in the most nascent form. It kind of gives you all of the setup, basically. And once you get down into what would more traditionally be thought of as play, so the rolling dice and the conversation of role playing, that's kind of dropping you directly into what would be the second act of the movie. So you drop in at the point that things start going wrong. But you don't feel like you've lost that lead up, because the character creation is the lead up. It's kind of the ramp to things going wrong, so that as soon as you are done with character creation, you are ready to just kind of throw those newly born characters into just horrible misery. And the character creation continues throughout, really, because every time you bring up one of those flashbacks, we're learning more and more about your characters. So it becomes I think someone described it as it's about tension and dread and relationships, which I think is a very good way of summing it up. I think that was Lauren, who's the editor and also one of the stretch goal authors, Lauren McManaman. But yeah, you really find out about the characters' relationships to each other as well if you're playing in a 2-player game. So that's a kind of a feature of the flashbacks, and also the kind of how they react to each other when the chips are really down in the kind of like the tense present day stuff. And that thing of making the character creation kind of definitely part of the play, that was inspired by Bluebeard's Bride. I don't know if you've
I mean, I have somewhere here like this.
Oh, I'm jealous. I only have the PDF. I'm very jealous. So the Bluebeard's Bride thing, where those character creation is very much part of the play, and kind of you build your version of the story from there, with all of like the gifts that the bride not the bride gave, and all of the things that Bluebeard likes and doesn't like about you, and that sort of stuff. And that's been the most kind of like playful version of character creation that I've experienced in the game, and I wanted to do something similar to that.
Yeah, and it's in my experience, a really cool way to get people into the appropriate mindset, kind of into the magic circle for horror, because for horror, players have to be in a specific zone.
Absolutely, yeah. It's so easy to get horror wrong, because it's hard to do when you don't have a special effects budget, you don't have lighting, you don't have a score. I mean, you can put some music on in the background, but it's never going to link up to do the that shrieking violins at just the right moment. So yeah, it depends on buy-in, absolutely, and by doing the character creation in that very collaborative, and the scenario creation in that very kind of collaborative, everyone feeding in, and actually it's mostly almost entirely like 90% the players building in at that point, and the GM is just kind of wrangling it effectively and asking follow-up questions. So I'm sorry, I've forgotten the original question now. Again, what was the question?
Kind of the follow-up question to this. I asked you like 3 or 4 questions at the same time.
No, it's fine.
But the follow-up question will be kind of how do these characters evolve through play, and how does it change? How does it change how we see them? Which you can have kind of answer already, but if there's any other thought about it.
So I think it's mostly through how they react to the horrible stuff that's happening in the present, and it's the stuff that we learn about them in the past, effectively, and that helps with the collaboration as well, because the present is very led by the GM, and the past is very led by the players. So you get kind of like an equal say in who that character is and how the story goes, effectively.
And I think that's really cool, because in my experience, we were talking about this, the GM has to kind of bring the horror things, like this is the things you are supposed to be scared about, but it's really the player who has to make a choice to be scared by those kind of things. At least for me.
Yes. We were talking about buy-in, weren't we?
Yeah. For me, it's like, okay, I'm going to get scared about this thing and play my character as being scared, and then at some point, like, you actually start to be scared for real. It kind of gets out of your hand. But there's kind of the initial choice you make, and I think the game is really clever in kind of giving the players that kind of all this agency to kind of make that step on their own, kind of do that kind of stuff.
Thank you. There has to be, like, as you say, like a certain amount of buy-in, a certain amount of suspension of disbelief. Because like I don't believe in ghosts, but if I go into The Woman in Black saying, well, I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not going to enjoy that movie, if I can just sit down and suspend my belief for a little while, then I'm going to have a great time. Anything that I can do to help that, anything that I can do to aid that suspension of disbelief and that buy-in, that's what the game's there for, effectively. So the kind of the building of the tension, both mechanically and reflected in the story, that's meant to help that. The character creation, where essentially the players tell you what they're interested in, I mean, they might not come out and say that, but kind of the questions are there to lead people in a certain direction. So it's not just you're somewhere isolated, which tells you that you're in trouble if anything bad happens, but it's also why does it pain you to be in that place, which tells you that it's going to be which reinforces kind of like the melancholy aspect. So it's kind of like it's implicit cats, effectively. The content, tone. I forget what the A is, but or is it just content and tone? Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, so it kind of lets you know what you're in for, even implicitly, even if the GM doesn't say it specifically.
And talking about the GM, what tools and advice and like all that kind of stuff does the game give to the GM to help them bring the horror, bring the melancholy, just play the role?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a significant chunk of the book which is GM advice, because it's quite as I said, we've talked about the player facing stuff, and there's a lot of player facing stuff in it. But it requires the GM to take that stuff and really kind of run with it. So there's a lot of advice on effectively how to GM like me, which I think it's kind of what most role-playing systems are. Here is how I GM. Here's how you can have a game which is similar to me GMing it. So I've put all of my kind of many, sadly, years of not sadly because I haven't enjoyed it, but just because I despair at how old I am. Years of GMing, especially GMing horror, which has always been my key genre, into it, and I've broken it down in agendas and principles in that kind of that PBTA style. And I've done that much more because in Blades in the Dark, there is so much that is mechanically there for the GM to do that agendas and principles are kind of like here. They're more advice than they are rules. Whereas in something like Apocalypse World or Dungeon World or Monster Hearts, they're rules rather than advice. And this falls more on the side of rules. So I'm just going to try and bring up some of the principles here. So it's some of the principles like embrace simple horrors, make side characters real, be a fan of the characters but be merciless. So, and then there's the agenda. So you've got stuff like make the world feel real but terrifying, fill the characters' lives with horror, tension, and melancholy, terrify the players but respect boundaries. Because the characters are going to be scared, but the important thing, as you say, is it's a horror game. You're there to scare the players effectively if you can, but you have to do that within the contract that you've agreed with them. So we also talk about safety tools. There's a whole chapter on playing safely, because a horror experience can go wrong. So you want to guard against that if at all possible, especially when you're talking about I mean, like literally the language that the game uses kind of lets you know what kind of game it is, because we're talking about anxiety, despair, hope, and yeah, so it's one where you have to know what you're going in for, but you also have to tread carefully, and you want to be able to get out. You don't want to have anyone stuck in a situation which suddenly becomes uncomfortable in a way that isn't fun, because it's meant to be uncomfortable in a fun way, much like watching a horror movie, but you don't want it to suddenly become the news, effectively. So there's lots of advice on safety, lots of advice on how to be scary, but also not be an arsehole, effectively.
Yeah.
So there's a significant. It's probably about half of the rules are actually how to GM this, because it's not like an MCing style of GMing that's required for this. So like Apocalypse World or Monster Hearts, you can kind of scup, especially Sword Crown and Unspeakable Power. You can essentially kind of set up scenes and then occasionally kind of like prod players in the right direction. The GMing style that's required in this is more kind of like a slightly more, I don't want to use adversarial, because that has like a very grognardy kind of tone to it, where it's like, I'm here to beat the players. But it it's more direct. It's less. It's less following them around and just kind of letting the players be themselves. It's very hard framey kind of a game.
Yeah, much more active instead of reactive, like in Monster Hearts and all that.
Yeah. And again, don't get me wrong, I love those games, but that's not the style of GMing that suits this game.
So, what is fun in the broadest sense of the word about being the MC in Quietus? Where does the fun come from?
Oh yeah, okay. So I think the fun comes from in reincorporating the stuff that the players have brought in. It allows you to push really hard in a way that a lot of indie games don't, because they're built on that very kind of collaborative MCing style as opposed to GM. So this is why I've called it a GM rather than an MC in this. So it's a different experience. It's an experience which you can't get in a lot of games, because in most games, if you're trying to kill the characters, you're kind of a dick, honestly. You can throw challenges at them, but you shouldn't be earnestly trying to kill them. Whereas this is a game, because you're only playing for 2 hours ish. You're only playing with these for one shot. So you can have that, and you can kind of go full throttle at the players and kind of dare them to survive effectively. So that's fun. I like this could make me sound weird. I like scaring people. I don't mean like, hiding behind doors and jumping out at them, but like in Bluebeard's Bride, for example, the shiver in fear thing. I really like going for that shiver in fear. And waiting to see if someone actually does go no, and then you go, yeah, there we go, I made you shiver. So yeah, if you're someone who likes horror, and if you're someone who likes the idea of creating horror, so if you like the idea of writing or kind of directing horror, and I think there are I think most horror fans have probably tried to write or had images of making a horror film at some point. So this is where you can get to be that horror movie writer for a couple of hours.
Great. Yeah, that sounds great. And talking more about the Kickstarter, tell us a little bit about the kind of the stretch goals, the extra content that we are looking to unblock, or that we have already unblocked. Just the highlights. I know there's a lot of different authors, all of them really amazing. So I don't know.
Yeah. So the Kickstarters, it's live at the minute. If my eyes go look like I'm slightly distracted, I'm not, but I've just switched over to the Kickstarter tab. So yeah, it's on Kickstarter. If you search for Quietus, it comes up. So it's an 8.5 by 8.5 book. It's going to look really beautiful because we've got some cracking art, which you can see on the Kickstarter page by Thoy Tran has done the cover. And
really
she's
beautiful. Yeah, really cool.
Thank you very much. Yeah, she's done a fantastic job. I must send you the original sketch that I sent her to say, kind of, can you do something like this? And that's why you hire artists to get from my shitty little stick men to just this fabulous cover. And it's kind of a wraparound as well, so you can kind of follow the story from the front cover to the back cover. So we've got that, and then we have these really striking high contrast line and color illustrations by Kasha Prinzing on the inside. So it's going to be a really pretty looking book, in addition to being what I think is a quality game. So we're fully funded. We are, as of now, we over 200% funded. I think it's about 230% funded, which is great, because honestly, it's my first Kickstarter. And you hope it'll fund, but you don't really know. So when it funded, I was delighted, and we've just been burning through stretch goals, which is lovely. But as I say, I have to maybe think of some more now, because there's still 18 days to go. So in terms of stretch goals, we've got scenarios. So there's quick start scenarios. So that kind of take care of all of that character creation stuff and all of that kind of ramp-in stuff, which you can use like entirely on their own, and they can be you can just play with those characters, or they're also a really good way of kind of like gathering what sort of stories you can tell Quietus. So we've got scenarios by Jason Morningstar, who wrote Fiasco. He's doing kind of a Rosemary's Baby kind of a thing.
Nice.
We've got Nelwaban, who's just about to release Home Again, which is this awesome magic realism PBTA game. She's doing a thing about Filipino mythology. We've got Alex Roberts, who's doing a scenario called Darling, which I've been pitching as Sexy Babadook.
Oh, nice.
Which is it's I'm just going to read out the her pitch for it here, which is the thing is, it likes you even as it eats you alive. It softly whispers your name, which is just gets me in all the way squeaky areas. Sarah Dobbs, who is a film critic and a friend of mine, is going to write an essay on melancholy horror.
Oh, I love essays on RPGs. I don't see them often enough. I really love them.
Yeah, and that's going to be really good as well. That she was kind of who I was referencing when I was talking about when I was kind of bagging on film critics, and I thought, oh, no, hang on, she gets a lot about the elevator tour as well, which is exactly why I asked her to do that stretch goal. So we've got that. We've got Heritage by Misha Bushiger, which is about a black couple who are haunted by some sort of presence at an old slave plantation. I got Hammond Hall by Brandon Leon Gambetta, which is kind of like the Big Chill, but without dead Kevin Costner, instead with demons that live in mirrors. That's going to be very cool. We've got Holes by Alex A.K., which is about the Lebanese Civil War, which sounds very, very exciting. Very, very excited for that one. We've got a medical horror from Becky Emerson, which I
just the idea, just the name, man.
Yeah, it's called Ward 16. It's my wife always teases me because I can watch the goriest horror movie and be absolutely fine, but as soon as it's like surgery, I'm like, nope, cannot cope. Even if it's like just some like light documentary on BBC, it's like there's something about medical procedures which just gets me. Hayley Gordon, who did Good Society, she is doing one called The Fruits of Our Labour, which is kind of like inspired by The Witch. Laura McManaman, who's also our editor, she's going to be doing one set in New Zealand about a criminal under house arrest. We've unlocked more art from Kasha Printing, which is going to be really awesome. So in terms of stuff that we've still got to unlock, we've got a doppelganger scenario by Kira McGran, which is going to be very cool. We know that she does good stuff with doppelgangers because she's a big David Lynch fan. And Josh Fox is doing a kind of rural gothic thing called A Wrecking. We've got, so those are all of the stretch goals that have been announced so far. We've unlocked all of them apart from the last one, so it's just Kira and Josh to unlock now. And once we get a little bit closer to that, I'm going to be announcing one last stretch goal author, and that'll be on my Twitter probably. So keep an eye out on the Twitter for who that is. You've heard of them. I mean, probably if you're into indie RPGs. And so after that, there may be some other stretch goals, but those are going to be all the scenarios that we do. But there might be some stretch goals, like I said, about like some linked scenarios, some rules on that, or some book upgrades. But those haven't been decided yet, so I'm still kind of like shoring the rest of those up. But it's funded, so it's definitely happening. So you can like guarantee that you're. Well, as close as a guarantee as you can get from Kickstarter. I promise I will deliver this book. It's almost entirely written. Everyone is signed up and good to get on it. And there's some cool higher pledge levels as well. So the very highest, which hasn't sold yet, and I appreciate why, is because it's very expensive. But is that you can get an entirely unique version of the book. So Thoy, our artist, has. She's agreed to do like 3 unique covers based on people's input, so you can get like a completely one-of-a-kind item with that one. You can also be in the book, so Kasha will draw you and put you in some sort of terrifying situation, if that sounds like a good thing to you. I think that sounds cool. Yeah, and you can also get games run by me. So I'll either run at either online or at a convention that I'm at. And you can get the book, and the book it just itself is going to be really cool. I'm very excited to bring it to you. And I've said this before, but like it kind of sounds like I'm shilling, but I'm not, because if I wasn't really excited about this game, if I didn't love it, then I wouldn't be able to run this Kickstarter, because running a Kickstarter is exhausting. So I need to believe in it, basically, in order to do this, and I do. It's going to be really good.
Cool. So that sounds all really cool. I'm really excited by all the different collaborators bringing their own stories. That sounds really amazing.
Yeah, but that's the thing is, like the stories that they've come up with. Like I could have easily written 13 horror stories, but I wouldn't have written those 13 horror stories. Like I don't know a thing about the Lebanese War, but that's something that Alex grew up with when they were growing up over there. It ended, I think, like 5 years after they were born. So if you go with people who have experiences outside of your experiences, then you're going to get a more diverse range of stories, and that can only be good.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of to wrap things up, a couple of like the last questions. First one will be because I kind of like to learn a little bit about the design process. Could you tell us a little some challenge or difficulty that you face in the process of creating the game, of writing the game, whatever, and how did you approach it, and how did you solve it?
Okay, yeah. So I think the biggest thing was, as we said, Blades and Dark's quite a heavy game. There's a lot of heavy's wrong because that makes it sound bad. It's a dense game, and it rewards mastery of all those little parts, like kind of like Burning Wheel or something like that. So I think part of the challenge was kind of reaching in and grabbing the parts that I needed and making sure that they still worked by themselves. And I think that's what you need to do if you're doing a Forge in the Dark hack. I mean, you can just kind of John has very generously put the SRD up online. You can just use it. But I would recommend, if you're doing it, kind of going in and really kind of internalizing each of the bits, because they're tied together, but they're not necessarily working all at the same time. It's not like a Rube Goldberg machine. It's more sort of like it's more like a computer, where this bit over here is your video card, this bit over here is your sound card, and they all have different things that they're doing. So I focused in very much on the what are they called? The score part of Blades in the Dark, and it was filtering bits out, kind of like going back and forth on what bits needed to stay in, which bits came out. Because the first playtest that I did with Donna McCarthy was very much just Blades in the Dark, and in that we kind of ran it with a very basic horror story and and from there. That was a big eye opener of like how much we can cut if we want to do just this thing. And balance is really hard as well. So the balance between, because there's no like mechanical difficulty to the rolls. There's only difficulty in how hard the consequences can get. There was a balance in. That's where most of the fine-tuning happened, is in just kind of making sure that those currencies went up at the right amount. And there was one game which actually came fairly late in playtesting, where it just kind of turned into an action movie because the players rolled really well, and there was a lot of like tweaking that happened after that. So yeah, I think it's just kind of making sure that the currencies do what they're meant to do. And the only way you can get that really is just playtest over and over. Iterate, basically.
Yeah. And finally, could you tell us a short story from playing the game? Something cool, something interesting, something representative, or whatever just comes to mind right now, so we can get a small idea of how it is to play the game.
Yeah, okay. I'm trying to think of because they've all been good sessions, is the thing. I think one of the sessions that I ran recently, which was again for the Party of One podcast, which I mentioned earlier. What I really liked in that is the kind of how we used the flashbacks to build this growing realization that the bad guy was the character that Jeff was playing, and the guy who was there to kill him, like, you shouldn't kill anyone, but if you're going to kill the guy that Jeff was playing, he was awful. I really liked how he used the flashbacks to build his character in a way that I wouldn't have expected. And I think that highlights the kind of like the player-led aspects of the game. And I also like that we managed to tell a sad story about a Vok. I think if you can tell a sad story about a Vok, then you've done something good.
That sounds really cool. So yeah, thanks a lot, Oli, for coming to the channel, to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking with you, and I really hope. The game is already doing great, but I hope it does even better. And I really recommend people to go and check it out this time. And I actually got the opportunity to play it, so I can recommend it. That it is good, it is great, it's a great experience, and it plays really well into kind of the experience that it's trying to evoke. So I definitely recommend people to check it out.
Thank you very much.
And before we go, remind you to I'm going to send all the links for myself as well as Oli, to remind you to if you're seeing this on Twitch, or even if you're not, follow us on Twitch to get all the notifications when we go live. If you want to help us, you can become a subscriber, get the access to the video. Like if you are right now wanting to, I don't know, rewatch the video of your miss, like a part or whatever, the moment if you are a subscriber, you can see it the moment like in just a few minutes. So that's something cool, and also you help the channel. And you have Amazon Prime, you can get that shit for free, which is
I didn't know that. I'm going to do that, definitely.
Oh yeah,
I didn't know the Amazon Prime thing.
Yeah, and if you are on YouTube, please give us a like. It costs nothing and it helps a lot. And share the video around. That's actually a massive help as well. And of course, become a subscriber to get all the videos when they go up. And if you want to get like kind of the notifications of what we're going to do in the channel, you can follow us on social media on Facebook and Twitter as Hijos del Rol, which you can find the how to write that right there if that's something you don't know how to write, which I understand. And yeah, I'm going to do some interesting announcements for a new Story Always episode very soon, so be on the lookout for that. I don't want to tell any yet who it is going to be, but it's going to be something really, really cool.
I know it is. It's
yeah,
very, very
yeah. He knows. He has insider knowledge. So yeah, thanks everyone for being in the chat, asking questions and following it. And I look forward to seeing all of you soon. Thanks again, Oli.
Thank you.
I hope to see you soon. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you, and see you next time.